The sun sank low over the towers of a medieval fortress, its light spilling across the stone in hues of crimson and violet. Within those walls walked King Henry III of England, robed in purple, his eyes heavy with the weight of decades. Beyond the battlements, faint but unmistakable, the silhouettes of mounted barons were gathering. These were not foreign invaders, but English noblemen, men bound by oath to serve their king, yet now drawn into defiance against him. The muffled sound of hooves reached the ramparts, a reminder that even the longest reign could not silence discontent. Henry paused, gazing toward the horizon where power and loyalty collided, and the question seemed to hang in the cooling air. How could a ruler so devout, so earnest in his piety, so long on the throne, find himself abandoned by those who once swore fealty to him? This paradox, at once tragic and compelling, marked the beginning of the Barons' War, a struggle not merely of arms but of ideals. If you find this story fascinating, remember to follow along, for the history of kings and rebels has much to teach about the present as well as the past. To understand Henry's plight, one must turn back a generation to his father, King John, a monarch whose failures shaped the destiny of the realm. John had lost the great Angevin lands in France and imposed taxes so heavy that his barons revolted. Their answer was Magna Carta, sealed at Runnymede in 1215, a charter that declared the king must govern within law, must consult his barons on taxation, and must abandon arbitrary rule. Though John himself sought to repudiate it, Magna Carta became a symbol, a living contract between crown and nobility, a reminder that even monarchy had limits. When John died in 1216, his son Henry was only 9 years old, a boy placed upon a throne riven by war. France's prince claimed England's crown, rebels held castles across the land, and the kingdom trembled on the edge of collapse. The boy king's survival rested in the hands of William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, a man celebrated across Europe as the greatest knight of his age. Marshal became regent, and with patience, pragmatism, and valor, he secured Henry's throne. He reissued Magna Carta in the boy's name, not once but multiple times, binding the crown to promises of fair governance. At the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, he led Loyalist forces to victory, driving the French invaders from English soil. To contemporaries, William Marshal was not merely a soldier, but a savior of the monarchy. On his deathbed, he urged Henry to rule with justice, to remember that the crown's strength came not from unchecked command, but from the balance between royal authority and noble counsel. For a time, that balance held. The realm, though scarred by years of war, entered a fragile peace. Castles lay in ruins, villages bore the marks of pillage, but the hope of stability was present. Yet beneath the surface, old questions remained unanswered. Magna Carta had planted a seed. If a king could be compelled to rule within limits, who would enforce those limits in generations to come? Each baron kept the memory of John's failures, and each watched Henry with cautious eyes. Henry grew into manhood with a vision of kingship shaped not by the sword, but by faith. He was no warrior king like Richard the Lionheart, nor the iron-willed governor like his grandfather Henry II. Instead, he was a dreamer of sacred visions, a monarch who saw himself first as servant of God. His reign was filled with ceremonies, pilgrimages, and the pursuit of beauty in the service of faith. Westminster Abbey, the great Gothic church he rebuilt, stood as a monument to his devotion, its soaring arches and painted windows a testament to his desire to link monarchy with the divine. He longed for England to be seen not only as a kingdom of warriors and laws, but as a holy realm, blessed by God and guided by sacred order. Yet his very virtues carried within them the seeds of failure. His piety made him generous, too easily persuaded by family and foreign favorites who crowded his court. His devotion to architecture and liturgy led him to spend lavishly on building projects, even as the treasury strained under the weight of wars and debts. He pursued costly dreams abroad, seeking to reclaim lost lands in France and, disastrously, to secure the crown of Sicily for his son, a venture that drained England of silver but returned no reward. Each tax levy, each demand for resources frayed the patience of his nobles who remembered their chartered rights and believed that the king had no authority to impose burdens without their consent. Among those nobles was a man who would come to embody opposition to Henry's rule, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. Born in France, heir to a family renowned for crusading zeal, Simon came to England to claim his inheritance. Through marriage to Eleanor, Henry's sister, he entered the royal family itself. At first, Simon was Henry's ally, admired for his courage and intellect. He fought loyally for the crown in campaigns abroad, stood beside the king in councils, and shared Henry's religious fervor. But Simon was also clear-eyed, a man who could see that faith without practical governance led to ruin. He watched as foreign courtiers from Poitou and Savoy dominated the king's household, their influence eclipsing that of England's native barons. He saw the treasury drained for ventures that yielded nothing but humiliation. His admiration gave way to disillusionment, and disillusionment hardened into conviction that reform was essential. In Simon, the barons discovered a leader of unusual charisma, one who could voice their grievances with clarity and embody their cause with moral force. Where others rebelled for advantage, Simon spoke of principle, that government must be shared, that taxation must come with consent, that a king was bound not only by God, but by law and counsel. His words resonated in a kingdom weary of burdens, and his authority grew. Thus the stage was set for a collision not merely between men, but between visions of kingship. On one side stood Henry, the pious dreamer, seeking to lift monarchy into the realm of the sacred, yet blind to the limits of earthly resources. On the other side stood Simon, the principled reformer, ready to challenge royal power, not to destroy the crown, but to bind it to law. Their struggle was the inheritance of Magna Carta, a continuation of questions left unresolved since Runnymede. Could a king be supreme, or must he govern by consent? Could faith sustain authority, or must it yield to the practical demands of justice? By the middle decades of the 13th century, England hovered at this crossroads. The long reign of Henry, which should have brought peace, instead revealed the contradictions at the heart of monarchy. The nobility no longer accepted royal will as unquestioned. The memory of rebellion was fresh, and the precedent of Magna Carta gave them confidence. To many, Henry's rule was not tyranny, but it was misrule. Wasteful, indecisive, guided by favorites rather than wise counsel. In this discontent lay the seeds of open conflict. The image of Henry on the fortress wall, staring into the distance, captures this historical moment. Behind him stood Westminster Abbey, radiant in its new Gothic beauty, a symbol of his faith and legacy. Before him gathered the restless power of his barons, a reminder that loyalty was conditional and that the future of monarchy was no longer assured. And within that gathering rose Simon de Montfort, once a brother-in-law and confidant, now the voice of opposition. This was not simply a story of rivalry between men. It was a drama that would define the political evolution of England. The confrontation between Henry and Simon would produce battles that shook the kingdom, but it would also give birth to institutions that endured. Out of war would come the beginnings of Parliament, the principle that common consent was essential to governance. The clash of pious king and principled rebel would shape the path of English liberty for centuries to come. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fortress into shadow, Henry could not know what the coming years would bring. He could not foresee the humiliations, the brief captivity, the moments when his crown seemed lost. Nor could he imagine that his reign, so troubled and so criticized, would nevertheless leave behind a legacy embedded in law and memory. What he did know in that quiet moment upon the wall was that the kingdom was restless, and that the barons who gathered beyond the horizon were no longer content to remain silent. The story of Henry III and the Barons' War is one of paradox and consequence, a story where faith and power, loyalty and rebellion, tradition and reform collided. It is a tale that reminds us that even the mightiest thrones rest upon fragile foundations, and that the consent of the governed has power to reshape history. If you have been drawn into this opening chapter, consider subscribing or following so you will not miss the chapters to come, where ideals clash with reality, and where the future of England hangs in the balance. Henry's childhood unfolded beneath the long shadow of guardianship, shaped not by his own choices, but by the hands of men entrusted with the crown. When his father John died, leaving the kingdom in disarray, The boy was scarcely 9 years old, unready for the burdens of kingship. Into that vacuum stepped William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, a figure whose reputation as the greatest knight of his age lent both stability and honor to a fragile throne. Marshal carried not only the weight of arms, but the weight of legitimacy. His counsel, his victories, and his sense of duty gave Henry a foundation, a chance to grow into his role without being consumed by the chaos that had nearly torn England apart. Under Marshal's regency, Henry's first years as king were years of restoration. Castles seized during Civil War were reclaimed, foreign soldiers expelled, and Magna Carta reissued as a pledge of reconciliation. William Marshal's wisdom provided a buffer against rebellion, his authority commanding respect from both noble and commoner. For a brief moment, England felt the stirrings of peace, the sense that the kingdom could heal after years of division. In these formative days, Henry learned that monarchy was not only a throne, but a trust, that a king depended on the loyalty and guidance of men stronger in arms and steadier in judgment than himself. But peace is fragile, and regents do not live forever. In 1219, William Marshal died, leaving the young king without his most trusted guardian. Henry, still little more than a child, was passed into the care of Hubert de Burgh, a man of humbler birth than Marshal, yet equally vital in preserving the monarchy. Hubert had risen from relatively modest origins to become Justiciar of England, the chief officer of royal government. Practical, shrewd, and fiercely loyal, Hubert defended Henry's interests against both foreign invaders and domestic rivals. It was Hubert who secured victory at sea against the French, ensuring that England would not fall under Capetian domination. It was Hubert who acted as the steady hand of governance, while the young king grew into adolescence. Through these years, Henry's reign seemed promising. His court was modest, his counselors careful, and his policies guided by men of experience. The kingdom, though still scarred by war, enjoyed a stability rare for the early 13th century. Henry himself was still forming, pious in disposition, gentle in manner, a boy who preferred the company of priests and builders to that of soldiers. His love for art and ritual already stirred, yet he remained dependent on those who managed the realm in his name. To many, it appeared that the dark days of King John were over, and that the monarchy might yet be restored to honor. Yet as Henry grew older, he began to seek independence, to step beyond the guardianship that had shaped his youth. With Marshal gone and Hubert's influence gradually waning, new figures began to emerge around the young king. These were men not of England, but of Poitou, the ancestral homeland his father had lost to France. They came as relatives, as courtiers, as claimants to favor, whispering of loyalty and promising service. Henry, bound by blood and sentiment, welcomed them. In their presence, he felt the connection to a broader Plantagenet heritage, to a France that his family had once ruled. But in welcoming them, he sowed the seeds of mistrust among his English barons. The Poitevins, savvy, ambitious, and eager for influence, began to dominate the royal household. Their language was French, their customs foreign, their loyalty more to the king's person than to the kingdom. To Henry, they were family and confidants. To his barons, they were interlopers, men who consumed resources and claimed offices that should have been held by Englishmen. Whispers of discontent spread through the halls of nobility that the young king was too trusting, too willing to place his future in the hands of outsiders. This shift marked the first cracks in the stability of Henry's early reign. The careful balance preserved by Marshal and Hubert gave way to favoritism and resentment. The barons who had once rallied to defend a child king against foreign threat now saw foreign faces at the very heart of the crown's household. The memory of Magna Carta lingered, reminding them that kingship was not absolute, that counsel and consent mattered. Henry, however, seemed blind to the danger. He was earnest, sincere, and convinced of his right to choose his companions. Yet, in choosing poorly, he laid the foundation for the tensions that would later explode into open conflict. Thus, Henry's youth was a paradox. Sheltered and safeguarded by the greatest knight and the shrewdest justiciar, he was given every chance to learn the lessons of balanced governance. Yet, the very qualities that defined him, his piety, his gentleness, his yearning for familial comfort, made him vulnerable to influence. As he stepped into adulthood, the realm that had once seemed secure began to bristle with unease. The boy who had been rescued by William Marshall, preserved by Hubert de Burgh, was no longer a child protected by guardians. He was a king, and his choices would shape the destiny of England. And so, in the still young reign of Henry III, the stage was already set for the conflicts that lay ahead. The crown had been saved, but the question of how it would be worn remained unresolved. In the quiet corridors of his court, under the influence of foreign kin, the seeds of future rebellion were quietly sown, awaiting the day when they would grow into the storm of the Barons' War. Henry grew into adulthood with a character shaped less by the thunder of battle than by the quiet rhythms of prayer. In an age when kings were expected to be warriors, he saw himself instead as a Christian ruler in the fullest sense, a man whose crown was not merely a political inheritance but a divine trust. To Henry, kingship meant more than governing laws or commanding armies. It was a calling, a sacred duty to embody the virtues of faith, humility, and devotion. He often spoke of himself as a model of the ideal Christian king, and his actions reflected that ambition. From his youth, Henry was drawn to the splendor of churches and the solemnity of liturgy. He loved the chanting of monks, the glow of candles, and the beauty of sacred art. While others delighted in the hunt or the tournament, he found joy in endowing monasteries, commissioning altars, and studying the lives of saints. His greatest earthly project, the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, was not simply an act of royal vanity, but a declaration of faith. He envisioned the Abbey as the spiritual heart of the kingdom, a house of prayer that would anchor England's monarchy in divine grace. The soaring Gothic arches, the intricate stonework, and the radiant stained glass were meant to testify that under Henry's reign, England was not merely a kingdom of men, but a kingdom consecrated to God. This devotion was not feigned or calculated. Contemporaries remarked on his genuine piety, his habit of attending Mass daily, his reverence for relics and rituals. Yet it was precisely this intensity of faith that over time distanced him from the harder realities of rule. Where other kings might have seen war as a necessity of power, Henry often recoiled from violence. He preferred negotiation, prayer, and gestures of clemency, even when firmness was required. His mercy, admirable in spirit, could be disastrous in politics. Nobles who defied him often found themselves pardoned only to rise again in defiance. Enemies treated with leniency learned quickly that the king's forgiveness was as reliable as it was exploitable. In council, Henry's mildness was both a virtue and a flaw. Courtiers and barons alike noted that he disliked confrontation, avoided harsh words, and shrank from decisive action. He could be warm, gentle, and gracious, winning affection with his sincerity. Yet when faced with disputes that demanded clarity, he wavered. His tendency to postpone decisions, to lean on the counsel of others, and to hope that problems might resolve themselves left his government vulnerable to manipulation. Those who surrounded him, family members, foreign courtiers, ambitious ministers, quickly learned that the king's goodwill could be bent to their own purposes. Henry's lack of firmness was not the product of weakness of will alone. It flowed also from his belief that kingship was sacred. He saw his office as an imitation of Christ's humility, and in striving to imitate gentleness, he often avoided the harsher tasks of judgment. He sought to rule by love and consensus rather than fear. But medieval politics was not a monastery. It demanded swift decisions, stern justice, and the ability to command obedience. Henry's subjects wanted a ruler who could protect their rights and defend their lands, and his reluctance to wield the harsher edges of authority left many disillusioned. Still, his reign cannot be dismissed as that of a timid man. There was courage in his vision, if not always in his actions. To imagine oneself as a Christian king in a world of shifting loyalties was to carry a burden heavier than steel. Henry longed to be remembered as a builder of cathedrals, a patron of learning, a monarch who sanctified his people by example. The tragedy was that these aspirations, so noble in intent, often blinded him to the pressing needs of governance. Wars had to be funded, justice enforced, barons held in check. Yet Henry returned again and again to the comfort of prayer and the splendor of ceremony. The contrast between his ideals and his reality grew sharper as his reign lengthened. He prayed for unity, but allowed divisions to fester. He sought peace, but taxed heavily to finance foreign ventures. He dreamed of holiness, but tolerated corruption at court. His personal faith inspired awe in some, but suspicion in others, who saw in him a ruler out of touch with the demands of kingship. For his barons, loyalty was not sustained by piety alone. They wanted strength, decisiveness, and the ability to guard the realm from both waste and disorder. And yet, despite his shortcomings, Henry remained a figure who commanded a certain reverence. Common people admired his devotion, seeing in him a king closer to the saints than to the warriors of old. Clergy praised his generosity to the church, even as they worried over his financial burdens. For those who longed for a gentler vision of monarchy, he was a reminder that kings could embody ideals higher than conquest. For those who demanded stability, he was a ruler who seemed unwilling to use the sword that destiny had placed in his hand. In the unfolding drama of his reign, this paradox defined Henry. He was at once admired and doubted, loved and criticized, pious, yet indecisive. He embodied the hope of a sacred kingship, but revealed the dangers of a crown guided more by prayer than by prudence. As the years passed, his gentleness would become the very quality that emboldened his critics, for they came to believe that a king who sought to rule as a saint risked losing his kingdom to men less holy, but more resolute. Thus, in Henry's character and in his faith lay the seeds of both his greatness and his downfall. He wished to be remembered as the Christian king of ideal form, but history would remember him as the king whose devotion and indecision opened the way for rebellion. The stage of the Barons' War was not built by malice or tyranny, but by a monarch whose virtues could not match the hard demands of his time. Henry's piety gave shape to his vision of kingship, but it was his ambitions in Europe that tested both his faith and his resources. From the earliest years of his reign, the memory of lost lands haunted him. His father, John, had surrendered Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou to the French crown, shattering the once vast Angevin Empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Henry inherited not only the English throne, but also the wound of those defeats, a wound that never healed. To him, regaining the family's continental inheritance was not merely a matter of pride. It was a sacred duty to restore what had been unjustly taken. Of the lost dominions, Gascony and Poitou held particular importance. Gascony, with its fertile vineyards and lucrative wine trade, tied England's economy to continental wealth. Poitou, the ancestral heartland of the Plantagenets, represented identity as much as territory. Henry dreamed of reclaiming them, of marching into France as a restorer rather than a supplicant. Yet the world he inherited was different from that of his grandfather, Henry II. The French monarchy had grown stronger under the Capetians. Castles once vulnerable were now fortified. Alliances once fragile were now entrenched. To wage war on France demanded not only valor, but immense resources, and Henry's treasury, already strained by his devotion to churches and rituals, could not match his dreams. Still, he tried. Expedition after expedition was launched across the Channel. Some ended in brief successes, others in costly failures, but none restored the empire. Each campaign required heavy taxation. Each failure left scars on the loyalty of his barons. To them, Henry seemed to be chasing phantoms, pouring England's wealth into a cause already lost. Yet in his heart, Henry saw himself as a son making amends for his father's disgrace. He prayed for victory, raised banners under the cross of St. George, and sought alliances that might tilt fortune in his favor. Marriage was one such alliance. In 1236, Henry wed Eleanor of Provence, a union that linked England with one of the most cultured courts of Europe. Eleanor was young, intelligent, and politically astute. She brought with her the refinement of southern France, poets and troubadours who filled the English court with new songs and new manners. For Henry, the marriage was both a personal joy and a diplomatic tool. Through Eleanor's kin, he hoped to strengthen ties with continental powers, creating a network of influence that might one day support his campaigns in France. Yet the marriage also introduced new tensions. Eleanor's relatives from Savoy and Provence soon arrived in England, seeking positions, titles, and wealth. To Henry, granting them favor was natural. After all, they were his queen's family, loyal and dependable in his eyes. But to the English barons, their presence echoed the intrusion of the Poitevins before them. Once again, foreigners seemed to dominate the royal household, securing lands and offices that native lords believed should be theirs. The very alliance meant to strengthen Henry's hand abroad weakened his authority at home, feeding the narrative that he was a king too easily swayed by outsiders. Even greater than his dreams of France was the astonishing ambition he nurtured for his son Edmund. The crown of Sicily, the papacy, embroiled in conflict with the imperial Hohenstaufen dynasty, offered Henry the Sicilian throne for his child if he would finance the campaign to seize it. To Henry, the offer seemed heaven-sent. To see his son crowned in the rich kingdom of Sicily at the crossroads of the Mediterranean would elevate his dynasty to heights even his ancestors had not achieved. It was, in his mind, both a divine opportunity and a chance to expand Plantagenet influence across Europe. But the cost was staggering. The Pope demanded vast sums to fund the war, and Henry, in his zeal, promised more than his coffers could bear. Year after year, he pressed his barons for taxes, insisting that the Sicilian crown was within reach. Year after year, the money vanished into papal coffers, while Edmund never set foot on Sicilian soil. What Henry saw as a holy venture appeared to his nobles as folly, draining the kingdom for a cause distant and improbable. The barons grumbled that they were financing the king's fantasies while their own lands bore the burden. To them, Henry's ambition was not noble but reckless, a dream that mortgaged the future of England to satisfy the vision of one man. The irony was cruel. Henry, who sought to embody the Christian king, found himself accused of betraying his people's trust in pursuit of foreign crowns. His marriage, meant to strengthen him, weakened his standing. His devotion to papal favor, intended to sanctify his reign, placed him deeper in debt to Rome. His campaigns in France, intended to restore his father's honor, instead revived the memory of Plantagenet defeats. And yet, one must see these ambitions not only as miscalculations, but as reflections of Henry's nature. He was not content to rule England alone. He carried within him the inheritance of a dynasty that had once spanned half of Europe. He believed it was his duty, even his destiny, to restore that grandeur. He prayed not for wealth or conquest, but for unity, for the Plantagenet name to shine again as it had under Henry II and Richard the Lionheart. The tragedy was that his resources did not match his vision, and his people's patience could not endure the cost of his dreams. As the years passed, the gap between Henry's ideals and his achievements widened. Gascony remained a contested territory, its loyalty purchased at great expense. Poitou never returned to English hands. Sicily remained an empty promise, a phantom crown that bled England's treasury dry. In seeking to expand his family's power, Henry had instead sown discontent at home, fueling the very tensions that would one day rise against him. Thus, Henry's European ambitions stand as a mirror of his reign, grand in vision, earnest in faith, but flawed in execution. He longed to be the king who restored what was lost, who crowned his son in glory, who knit together England, France, and Sicily under the banner of a Christian monarchy. But in pursuing those dreams, he revealed the limits of his governance, the fragility of his authority, and the growing impatience of his barons. In the clash between vision and reality, the seeds of the Barons' War were sown more deeply still, awaiting the moment when disappointment would turn into open defiance. The weight of Henry's European dreams soon pressed heavily on the shoulders of his kingdom. Every campaign across the Channel, every petition to Rome for the Sicilian crown, every stone laid in the soaring vaults of Westminster Abbey demanded money. The resources of a medieval monarchy were not limitless. They came from the land, from customs on trade, from the pockets of nobles, clergy, and commoners alike. And under Henry, those demands grew insistent year after year until the murmur of discontent began to echo through every corner of the realm. The war in France had already drained England's coffers. To maintain Gascony, Henry relied on constant military outlays, the hiring of mercenaries, the provisioning of garrisons, the supply of fleets. Each venture required subsidies from the barons and taxation imposed on the shires. But Gascony, far from being a source of profit, became a sinkhole of expense. The revenues it produced never equaled the costs of defending it. To many in England, it seemed that the king was pouring treasure into a land that could never be secured. Then came the Sicilian project. When the papacy dangled the crown before Henry, he grasped it with fervor, but the cost of that grasp was staggering. The Pope demanded immense payments to fund the struggle against the Hohenstaufen rulers, who then held Sicily. Henry promised the sums, believing that God's blessing would accompany his cause. But in practice, the money had to be raised in England, through extraordinary taxes on the clergy, through subsidies voted by reluctant barons, through levies on merchants who already bore the strain of customs duties. What Henry described as a holy cause, many of his subjects saw as an endless drain to satisfy the ambitions of Rome. The barons grumbled that England was being mortgaged for a dream far beyond the seas. And, as if wars and papal projects were not enough, there was Westminster Abbey. To Henry, it was his sacred legacy, the monument by which generations would remember his reign. The Abbey's reconstruction was his offering to God, a house of prayer that would sanctify the monarchy. But to build it required masons, artists, imported stone, and costly adornments. Year by year, funds were diverted to its soaring arches and brilliant glass. What Henry saw as devotion, many lords saw as extravagance. The peasants and townsmen who carried the indirect weight of these expenses could not fail to notice the burden in their rents and dues. The clergy, too, began to show unease. Though they revered Henry's piety, they resented the repeated demands upon their revenues. Taxes on the church were justified as support for crusades or holy wars, but too often they seemed to vanish into ventures with little hope of success. Bishops complained that their sees were impoverished, monasteries found their income squeezed, and resentment grew even among those who once had been the king's firmest supporters. For the nobility, the constant financial pressure sharpened old suspicions. They recalled Magna Carta's promise that taxation required counsel and consent. Yet Henry's levies often felt less like consultation than compulsion. Parliaments were summoned not to deliberate, but to approve what the king had already decided. The barons saw their wealth drained, their voices ignored, and their patience worn thin. The image of Henry as a saintly monarch began to blur into that of a ruler out of touch with his people. His generosity to foreign courtiers, his devotion to distant causes, his grand building projects, all were funded by taxes that bit deeply into the resources of the realm. To Henry, these were the necessary costs of kingship, the marks of a Christian ruler's duty. To his subjects, they were the signs of mismanagement, of a king who loved ceremony and ambition more than the welfare of his land. And so, beneath the prayers and pageantry, beneath the glories of Westminster's rising towers, discontent stirred. Each tax was more than a financial demand. It was a reminder that the king's vision came at their expense. Each levy deepened the divide between crown and baronage, between altar and treasury, between the king who dreamed of sacred monarchy and the subjects who bore the cost. The stage was being set once more for confrontation as the burden of Henry's taxes turned reverence into resentment and loyalty into resistance. The resentment stirred by taxation was sharpened further by the company Henry chose to keep. From his earliest years, he had leaned upon foreign relatives and courtiers, men and women whose tongues spoke French rather than English, whose loyalties seemed bound more to family ties than to the kingdom itself. To Henry, they were trusted confidants, bound to him by blood and affection. To the English nobility, they were intruders who drained the resources of the realm and monopolized royal favor. The Poitevins, descendants of his Lusignan kin, were among the first to gain influence. They had followed Henry's mother from Poitou, carrying with them the manners, ambitions, and accents of their homeland. In Henry's eyes, they were loyal allies in a hostile world. He granted them lands, castles, and offices, welcoming them into the circle of power at court. Yet every grant, every appointment, came at the expense of English lords who believed such honors rightly theirs. Whispers turned into open complaints. The king was elevating foreigners over his own people. Later came the Savoyards, kin of Queen Eleanor of Provence. They arrived in England with hopes of carving out estates and positions within the royal administration. Their refinement and continental sophistication impressed Henry, who saw in them the culture and dignity he longed to embody in his monarchy. They brought with them the glamour of southern courts, of troubadours and polished diplomacy. But for the English barons, their arrival was yet another insult. What Henry saw as elegance, his nobles saw as encroachment. The court, once an English household, seemed to them transformed into a foreign enclave. Most controversial of all were the Lusignans, half-brothers of Henry through his mother's remarriage. Bold, ambitious, and often quarrelsome, they pressed their claims in England with a vigor that unsettled the native nobility. Henry, bound by maternal loyalty, showered them with privileges and defended them against accusation. But their arrogance and hunger for wealth made them deeply unpopular. Chroniclers recorded the bitterness of Englishmen who saw their king surrounded by brothers of foreign birth, men who seemed to command more trust than the ancient nobility of the realm. The image of the royal palace in these years was striking. Corridors filled with the chatter of French dialects, chambers occupied by men who owed their origins to Poitou, Savoy, and Lusignan castles. To the common people who glimpsed them in procession, these courtiers appeared not as loyal servants of England, but as foreigners who consumed its wealth. The contrast was vivid. Peasants paying heavier rents, townsfolk straining under new tolls, while richly dressed strangers moved confidently within the heart of the king's household. For the barons, the symbolism was intolerable. It was not simply the loss of offices or lands. It was the sense that the king himself had become captive to foreign influence. They remembered Magna Carta's promise that government should respect tradition and native counsel, yet what they saw before them was a monarchy increasingly insulated by outsiders, a crown less English than continental. Henry, in his sincerity, never grasped the depth of this resentment. He believed that loyalty was a matter of personal faithfulness, not national origin. If these men were true to him, then they were worthy of trust. To his mind, the criticism of his foreign relatives was unfair, even cruel. But in overlooking the grievances of his nobles, he underestimated the political cost. Each new Lusignan grant, each Savoyard appointment, each Poitevin gift widened the gulf between crown and baronage. Thus, the court of Henry III became a symbol of division. To the king, it was a family bound by affection and loyalty. To his subjects, it was a household overtaken by foreigners. This perception deepened the bitterness already stoked by taxation and misrule. And in that bitterness, the resolve of the barons hardened. They would no longer accept a monarchy that seemed less the guardian of England and more the patron of outsiders. The stage was set for confrontation, not only over money and law, but over the very identity of the kingdom itself. Who truly guided the crown? The people of England, or the foreign kin of its king? It was a question that would fuel suspicion, sharpen anger, and drive the realm closer to the conflict that history would remember as the Barons' War. Beneath the quarrels of barons and courtiers, another tide of discontent was swelling in England. It did not rise from the halls of Westminster, but from the fields and towns, from the peasants who worked the land and the merchants who carried England's trade across seas and markets. For them, the burdens of Henry's reign were not measured in parchment charters or noble titles, but in coin collected at the gate, in tolls paid on the road, and in rents that grew heavier with each new levy decreed by the crown. The peasantry, bound to manors and dependent on the rhythm of harvests, felt the pressure most keenly. Taxes imposed to fund wars in France or to finance distant claims in Sicily were collected from the lords, but the lords in turn pressed down upon their tenants. Fields that once yielded a modest living now had to carry the added weight of royal demands. For the farmer, the wars across the sea meant little, but the tax collector meant everything. Each demand from the crown rippled outward, and it was the villagers who bore the final cost. In the towns, resentment took a different shape. The merchant class of England was growing in strength, carried on the rise of wool exports, trade in wine, and the expansion of markets. These men, shrewd and practical, paid customs at the ports, tolls at the bridges, and fees in every transaction. They knew that their wealth fueled the crown's ventures, yet they had little voice in how that wealth was spent. When Henry demanded subsidies, it was their coffers that were tapped, and when his policies faltered, it was they who suffered disruption in trade. The towns themselves, London foremost among them, were becoming centers of political energy. Citizens guarded their charters jealously, the documents that guaranteed their liberties and defined their rights against arbitrary royal interference. They remembered Magna Carta's promise that even the king must respect established customs, and they looked upon Henry's court with wary eyes. Foreign courtiers parading in finery, lavish expenditures on abbeys and continental wars, heavy dues demanded without true consultation, all seemed to them signs of a monarchy heedless of the realities of commerce. The discontent of the merchants was particularly dangerous, for they were not powerless. Towns provided money, credit, and supplies that kings desperately needed. Without the goodwill of London's guilds or the cooperation of provincial markets, royal finances could collapse. Already there were murmurs that England's rulers should heed not only the barons, but also the voice of townsmen whose prosperity sustained the realm. This tension marked a turning point in English society. In earlier generations, the struggle between king and nobility had dominated politics, but under Henry, a broader sense of participation began to stir. The merchants and burgesses of the towns, men who built fortunes not on ancestral land but on trade, started to see themselves as stakeholders in the kingdom's fate. They were not yet a parliament, not yet a class formally acknowledged in governance, but the idea that they ought to have a voice was germinating. For Henry, whose vision of kingship was steeped in sacred duty and hereditary right, this undercurrent was easy to overlook. He dealt with barons, bishops, and knights, as kings had always done. But in the marketplaces and guild halls, in the counting houses and quaysides, the murmur of another England was rising, an England that believed the burdens it carried entitled it to be heard. Thus, the discontent in the countryside and towns became the quiet chorus to the louder grievances of the barons. While nobles spoke of charters and councils, common folk spoke of rents and dues. While lords complained of foreign courtiers, merchants complained of lost profits and neglected liberties. Together, these voices formed a groundswell of frustration that would soon converge with noble rebellion. For the Barons' War was never only about barons. It was about the kingdom itself, from plough to market stall, from manor to guild hall, each bearing the cost of a king whose dreams outpaced his means. Simon de Montfort entered the stage of English history with a name already wrapped in both glory and controversy. He was the son of Simon de Montfort the Elder, the formidable crusader who had led the Albigensian Crusade in southern France. That elder Montfort had been remembered as a man of unyielding faith and relentless ambition, admired by some for his devotion to the church, reviled by others for the ferocity of his methods. The younger Simon inherited both the legacy of his father's name and the burden of living up to it. He grew up in a France marked by crusade, piety, and strife, a world where loyalty to faith and family was prized above all else. It was this background, forged in both devotion and discipline, that he carried with him when he crossed into England to claim his inheritance. England was, in many ways, a new beginning for Simon. He came not as a conqueror, but as an heir seeking to establish his rights to the earldom of Leicester. The claim was not without dispute, and his arrival placed him immediately in the shifting currents of English politics. Yet Simon possessed qualities that drew attention quickly. He was tall, commanding in presence, eloquent in speech. He combined the rigor of his crusader lineage with the sharp mind of a statesman. Where others relied solely on the strength of arms, Simon relied also on persuasion, on the ability to frame grievances as principles, and to cloak ambition in the language of justice. His path to prominence accelerated through marriage. In 1238, Simon wed Eleanor, the widowed sister of King Henry III. It was a union that shocked many at court. Eleanor had taken vows of chastity after her first husband's death, and her marriage to Simon, conducted in secrecy and without broad consultation, stirred whispers of scandal. Yet Henry, though surprised, eventually gave his approval, moved in part by affection for his sister and in part by recognition of Simon's growing importance. The marriage bound Simon directly to the royal family, placing him not only among the king's noble companions, but within his bloodline. Through Eleanor, Simon gained both legitimacy and intimacy with the crown. He became a frequent figure in the royal household, a man whose advice Henry sometimes sought and whose military skill he relied upon. In foreign campaigns, Simon proved his valor, leading forces with discipline and courage. His loyalty to Henry in these early years seemed firm, and the king, ever in need of strong allies, valued his brother-in-law's counsel. At feasts and councils, in campaign tents, and in chapel services, Simon's presence was felt. He was no longer the outsider from France. He was a man at the heart of English power. Yet even in these years of rising influence, hints of the future could be discerned. Simon was not a man to content himself with ceremonial honor. He had a seriousness of purpose, a conviction that kingship itself must be guided by principle. His education and upbringing had instilled in him a belief in moral order, in the binding power of law and oath. Unlike many nobles who viewed royal favor as an end in itself, Simon saw it as a means to a greater responsibility. He spoke often of justice, of the duty of rulers to their subjects, of the balance between authority and fairness. Such words resonated with those who had grown weary of Henry's indecision and extravagance. Still, for the moment, Simon stood beside the king rather than against him. He fought in Gascony, defending England's precarious hold on its last continental possession. He advised Henry in matters of policy, and he strengthened his family's position through alliances and friendships. He was not yet the rebel who would challenge royal power. He was the loyal brother-in-law, a crusader's son who had found in England a stage worthy of his talents. But in the court's crowded halls, filled with Savoyards, Poitevins, and Lusignans, Simon's voice began to carry a different weight. Where others flattered, he challenged. Where others sought gifts, he argued for reform. His marriage gave him proximity to the throne, but his character gave him something rarer, the courage to speak what others only whispered. He was ambitious, yes, but his ambition wore the mantle of conscience. And in a realm where barons grumbled at taxes, townsmen murmured about liberties, and peasants bore the burdens of war, Simon's blend of conviction and charisma made him a figure to watch. In those early years, few could have foreseen how this foreign-born noble would come to embody the hopes of reform and the fury of resistance. Yet the seeds were already planted. In his lineage, in his marriage, in his words and deeds, Simon de Montfort was preparing for a role far greater than courtier or commander. He was preparing, though perhaps even he did not yet know it, to challenge the very nature of kingship in England. Simon de Montfort's rise in England was not only a matter of marriage, military service, or personal charisma. It was also shaped by a set of ideas that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Where others measured politics by favor and fortune, Simon measured it by principle. His inheritance from France was not only the crusader's zeal of his father, but also a deep respect for order and law, a conviction that authority should be bound by agreements rather than exercised at whim. In England, this conviction found fertile ground. The memory of Magna Carta still loomed large over the realm. Signed by King John under pressure and reissued in the early years of Henry's reign, it had become more than parchment. It was a symbol that kingship itself was subject to limits, that rulers could not impose their will without counsel. Many nobles regarded it as a shield against royal overreach, but for Simon it was something more. He believed Magna Carta was not simply a defensive measure for barons, but the foundation of a new kind of governance, one in which the king and his leading subjects ruled together under law. This conviction placed Simon in tension with the character of Henry III. Where Henry's kingship was steeped in divine sanctity and personal devotion, Simon insisted that monarchy must also answer to practical accountability. He saw the mounting debts of the crown, the endless demands for taxation, and the waste of resources on foreign ventures. To Simon, such mismanagement was not merely unfortunate. It was a breach of the trust between ruler and ruled. He began to argue that the barons, as guardians of the realm, had not only the right, but the duty to oversee how royal revenues were spent. This idea, that financial control was the key to political reform, was revolutionary for its time. Kings had long claimed the right to levy taxes as they pleased, restrained only by the resistance of the powerful. But Simon gave that resistance a framework. He spoke of shared governance, of government by agreement, where extraordinary taxation required the consent of those who paid it. In his vision, Magna Carta was not a relic of rebellion, but a living document, a covenant binding crown and barons alike. Such ideas resonated in a kingdom strained by Henry's extravagance. The nobles, weary of seeing their resources drained for French wars and Sicilian fantasies, found in Simon's words a rallying cry. Townsmen, though not yet formally represented in councils, sensed that their grievances too were acknowledged in this call for oversight. Even among the clergy, there was recognition that unchecked royal demands had endangered the stability of their estates. Simon's political thought was not abstract philosophy, it was sharpened in practice. During his tenure in Gascony, he witnessed firsthand the corruption and inefficiency of royal administration. He saw governors enrich themselves while royal revenues dwindled, and he grasped how distant mismanagement fed discontent at home. For him, reform was not simply a moral duty, but a necessity for the survival of monarchy itself. If kings did not govern with restraint and in consultation with their realm, they would provoke resistance that could undo their thrones. This belief gave Simon an unusual position. He was at once loyal to the institution of monarchy and critical of the way it was exercised. He did not dream of abolishing kingship. He dreamed of rescuing it from self-destruction. His model was not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but partnership grounded in oath and law. It was a vision of kingship transformed from personal prerogative into shared responsibility. Henry, however, could scarcely comprehend such a perspective. To him, monarchy was sacred, its authority flowing from God. To place limits on that authority seemed not only dangerous but irreverent. Thus the two men, though bound by family and circumstance, stood worlds apart in their understanding of kingship. For Henry, governance was divine trust. For Simon, it was human covenant. In this difference lay the seeds of conflict. Simon's respect for Magna Carta, his demand that the nobility oversee royal finances, his embrace of government by agreement, all these ideals gave structure to the grievances of a kingdom weary of burdens. In his thought, the language of discontent was translated into principle, and principle into action. He was no longer merely a baron of influence or the king's brother-in-law. He was becoming the voice of a new vision for England. That power must be shared, that kingship must be bound by law, and that no crown could long endure without consent. At first, the relationship between Simon de Montfort and Henry III was marked by closeness, even affection. Simon had arrived in England as something of an outsider, yet through his marriage to Eleanor and his loyalty and service, he won a place not only at court, but in the king's confidence. Henry admired Simon's courage and discipline, and for a time the two men seemed bound by mutual respect. They prayed together, dined together, and marched together into Gascony, where Simon proved himself a capable commander in the king's cause. At moments, Simon was not only Henry's brother-in-law, but his friend, a rare figure who could speak to the king with candor and still be heard. But friendship in politics is seldom secure. As Henry's reign progressed, the king's indecision and costly ambitions began to weigh heavily on his nobles, and none felt the strain more than Simon. Where Henry saw a divine mission, Simon saw financial ruin. Where Henry spoke of loyalty to Rome, Simon counted the coins drained from England's treasury. The Sicilian project, in particular, became the breaking point. Henry's promise to the Pope that his son Edmund would be crowned King of Sicily was made with more zeal than foresight. The price of that promise was staggering, and year after year the barons were pressed for funds. What Henry defended as a sacred duty, Simon condemned as folly. In council, Simon grew increasingly outspoken. He reminded the king that Magna Carta bound the crown to rule with consent, that taxation without restraint endangered not only the barons' fortunes, but the very stability of the realm. Henry, sensitive to criticism, bristled at Simon's boldness. To be corrected by a noble was one thing. To be challenged by a brother-in-law was quite another. Their conversations, once marked by warmth, turned sharp. Henry accused Simon of ingratitude, of forgetting the honors bestowed upon him. Simon, in turn, accused Henry of squandering his people's trust. Gascony, too, strained their bond. Simon had governed there with rigor, attempting to impose justice on a turbulent province. Yet Henry, swayed by complaints and rival factions, questioned his methods. Accusations of severity were brought against Simon, and rather than defend his brother-in-law, Henry hesitated, leaving Simon exposed. The loyalty that Simon had once felt began to erode, replaced by a conviction that the king lacked the steadiness to govern well. The final breach came when Henry's Sicilian dreams collapsed in failure. Edmund never touched the crown promised to him. The papal coffers had been filled with English gold, while England itself grew restless under the burden of debt. It was in this climate of disillusionment that Simon's voice rose to prominence. No longer content to advise, he became the articulate critic of the very policies he had once sought to guide. To many, he gave shape to what they had long whispered, that Henry was a pious man, but not a prudent king. Thus, the transformation was complete. The two men who had once knelt side by side in prayer became adversaries across the council table. Henry, wounded by betrayal, saw in Simon a rebel against divine authority. Simon, emboldened by principle, saw in Henry a monarch whose failures endangered the realm. Their conflict was not only personal, but symbolic, the collision of two visions of kingship, one rooted in sacred prerogative, the other in covenant and consent. From this breach, the road to confrontation stretched clear. Simon de Montfort, once a loyal companion, had become the leader of opposition. Henry III, once surrounded by friends and family, now found his own brother-in-law among his sharpest critics. And in that rupture, the stage was set for the struggle that would engulf England in the Barons' War. The year 1258 marked a decisive turn in the long and uneasy reign of Henry III. By then, decades of strained finances, foreign influence, and unfulfilled ambitions had pushed the patience of England's nobility to the breaking point. The collapse of the Sicilian project had been especially humiliating. Henry's dream of crowning his son Edmund King of Sicily had drained the realm of treasure and credibility. The Pope had withdrawn his support, leaving Henry indebted and disgraced, and his barons, who had long grumbled at the burden of taxation, saw at last a chance to force change. What had simmered for years now reached a boil, and at the heart of it stood Simon de Montfort, transformed from royal confidant to leading critic of the crown. The moment came in Oxford in the spring of that year. Henry had summoned his barons, hoping to secure fresh aid to mend his finances. Instead, he found himself confronted by a coalition determined not to fund another round of mismanagement. They came not only with grievances, but with a plan. For years, Magna Carta had provided a symbol of limits on the crown, but the barons now sought something more tangible, a framework to ensure that the king could no longer govern without oversight. At Oxford, their demands were presented with a unity and firmness that Henry could not evade. What emerged from these deliberations became known as the Provisions of Oxford. They were not a casual set of suggestions, but a binding agreement forced upon the king, a constitution in miniature that sought to transform the monarchy into a system of shared rule. Its centerpiece was the creation of a council of 24 men, half chosen by the king, half by the barons, who would together supervise the governance of the realm. No longer could the king act solely on his own will. Appointments, finances, and policy would pass through the scrutiny of this council. For the nobility, this was a triumph, the culmination of decades of frustration. It meant that their voices would no longer be dismissed as mere advice, but institutionalized as part of government. For Henry, it was a humiliation. A king who believed himself the anointed servant of God was now reduced to a monarch bound by committee. Yet, weakened by debt and lacking support, he had no choice but to sign. His seal on the provisions marked the beginning of what contemporaries called the government of the barons. The symbolism of Oxford was powerful. In the vaulted halls of the university city, amid cloisters echoing with chants of scholars, the nobility had compelled their king to accept restraint. Chroniclers recorded the scene as one of solemn gravity, a moment when the balance of power in England visibly shifted. Where once the king had been master, he was now overseen. Where once consent was requested, it was now required. For Simon de Montfort, the provisions of Oxford were more than a political victory. They embodied his vision of governance by agreement, of monarchy transformed into partnership. Though he was not the sole author, his influence was unmistakable. He had long argued that the barons must oversee finances, that law must bind the crown, and that governance must be exercised in consultation. At Oxford, those arguments became reality. The provisions went further still. They called for regular parliaments, meetings held 3 times a year, where the council would report and the business of the realm would be deliberated. This was no small innovation. While councils had long existed, their meeting was now institutionalized, their authority strengthened. What had been occasional gatherings summoned at the king's pleasure became, under the provisions, a fixture of governance. In this, one can glimpse the embryo of the parliamentary tradition that would shape England's future. To the barons, the reforms promised accountability. To the towns and clergy, they offered a hope that their burdens would no longer be imposed without some measure of restraint. But to Henry, the provisions were chains upon his crown. Though he signed, though he bowed to the force arrayed against him, he never accepted them in his heart. His piety told him that kingship was sacred. His pride told him that monarchy was indivisible. He waited for the day when he could shake off the yoke. Yet for the moment, the provisions stood. The barons moved swiftly to implement them, appointing officials, overseeing finances, and curbing the influence of foreign courtiers who had so long dominated the court. Savoyards and Lusignans were dismissed, royal revenues were monitored, and new sheriffs installed with baronial approval. It was as if the machinery of monarchy had been pried open and refitted before the eyes of the realm. The people, too, watched with interest. Villagers and townsmen, though far removed from the politics of Oxford, sensed the change. If taxes grew lighter, if justice proved more consistent, if foreign courtiers were curbed, then perhaps the burdens they had borne might ease. Hope mingled with uncertainty, for the experiment was fragile, untested, and dependent on the cooperation of men who often placed ambition above principle. The provisions of Oxford, in truth, were less a permanent solution than a declaration of intent. They declared that kingship could be challenged, that government could be reshaped, and that the authority of the crown was not absolute. They stood as a warning to Henry and as a precedent for the future, but they also sowed seeds of further conflict, for no king could long endure such restraints without seeking to throw them off. In that moment of 1258, England witnessed a turning point. The dream of absolute monarchy faded, and the experiment of shared governance began. The barons had seized power, Simon de Montfort had risen as their most articulate leader, and Henry had been forced to bend. Yet the story was far from over, for in the years to come, the struggle between king and barons would test whether these provisions were a foundation for reform or merely the opening act of civil war. The provisions of Oxford had shackled the crown, but no oath imposed under duress ever truly bound Henry III's heart. From the moment his seal was pressed onto that parchment in 1258, he harbored a determination to undo it. To him, the arrangement was not reform, but humiliation. He, a king anointed by God, reduced to a ruler whose actions were dictated by a committee of nobles. He yielded outwardly, but inwardly he seethed. For a brief time, the new order seemed to hold. The Council of 24 assumed its functions, foreign favorites were dismissed, and the barons congratulated themselves on having rescued the realm from misrule. Yet beneath the surface, Henry plotted. He attended councils, listened in silence, even smiled at times, but his mind wandered to Rome. If Magna Carta had once been checked by papal approval, so too could the provisions be undone. The Pope, supreme in Christendom, was the one authority who could absolve him of the promises he had been forced to make. The image of Henry in those months was striking. The devout king, kneeling in chapels, lips moving in prayer, eyes fixed upon the crucifix. But behind those folded hands lay calculation. Letters were dispatched to the papal court, envoys sent to plead the king's case. They argued that the provisions had been extorted, that they usurped the rightful prerogatives of monarchy, and that they threatened the divine order itself. To Henry, the barons were not guardians of law, but usurpers in noble garb, daring to place themselves above the crown. Rome was receptive. The papacy, ever cautious of noble leagues that weakened royal power, saw in Henry's appeal both a theological and political cause. Kings were God's lieutenants on earth. To bind them by oath to their subjects was to invert the sacred hierarchy. A papal bull was issued, annulling the provisions, declaring them void as an affront to the authority of the crown and to the divinely ordained order of Christendom. Chroniclers later described the scene when Henry, at last, received the document. In the hushed stillness of a church, he knelt before the altar, the papal bull unfurled in his hands. The wax seal of Rome dangled from its cords, glinting in the candlelight. Raising it aloft, Henry declared before God and his attendants that he was free from the Council of 24, free from the restraints of Oxford, free once more to rule as king by sacred right. The vision is cinematic. The king, humbled yet exalted, holding high the decree that dissolved his shackles, while the shadows of the nave stretched long behind him. But if Henry felt liberated, his barons felt betrayed. To them, the provisions had not been mere rebellion, but a solemn covenant to save the kingdom from ruin. For the king to cast them aside was to break faith, to dishonor the trust sworn in council. They had believed, however reluctantly, that their reforms could endure. Now they saw that Henry's compliance had been only a mask, worn until Rome gave him the weapon he desired. The result was a rapid escalation of conflict. Meetings once filled with cautious cooperation soured into recriminations. Barons, who had once spoken of partnership, now spoke of treachery. The realm split into factions. Those loyal to the crown, who upheld the papal absolution, and those loyal to reform, who argued that the liberties of England could not be annulled by foreign decree. Simon de Montfort emerged as the loudest of these voices. To him, the Pope's bull was not an act of liberation, but a confirmation of everything wrong in Henry's rule: dependence on Rome, disregard for promises, and blindness to the grievances of the kingdom. He denounced the annulment as illegitimate, declaring that oaths made in council and before the nation were higher than any absolution from afar. His words found eager listeners among barons weary of taxation and townsmen wary of foreign influence. Henry, however, pressed forward. Empowered by Rome's decree, he began to reassert control. Officials dismissed under the provisions were restored, foreign relatives welcomed back to court, and the machinery of royal government once more moved at the king's command. Each act, however, deepened the rift. The very reforms that had given the kingdom hope were now rolled back, and with their undoing came a sense of betrayal too deep to heal. Thus, the conflict that had long brewed in whispers and negotiations now leapt into open defiance. The provisions of Oxford had promised a new balance of power. Their annulment returned the kingdom to its old divisions, sharpened by distrust and resentment. Henry's reliance on papal authority only fueled the sense that England was governed not by Englishmen, but by foreigners, whether clerics in Rome or courtiers in Savoy. The stage was set for confrontation. The king, armed with the blessing of the Church, stood firm in his conviction that monarchy was indivisible and sacred. The barons, emboldened by Simon de Montfort's leadership, rallied to the principle that government must rest on agreement and law. Between these two visions, reconciliation became impossible. The annulment of the provisions had not ended the struggle. It had lit the fuse of war. By 1264, the fragile balance that had held England together finally shattered. Years of grievances, broken promises, and mounting distrust could no longer be contained by parchment or council. The annulment of the provisions of Oxford had transformed frustration into fury. The barons, who once hoped to reform the monarchy through law, now turned to the sword. Civil war, long whispered as a possibility, erupted openly in the spring of that year. The figure at the center of rebellion was Simon de Montfort. Once brother-in-law and confidant of Henry III, he had become the rallying point for disillusioned nobles. His voice, firm and uncompromising, framed their cause not as treason, but as defense of the kingdom's liberties. Under his banner, disaffected barons gathered men, raised levies, and prepared for war. The symbolism was unmistakable. Simon, a foreign-born noble, had become the champion of England's laws against an English king who seemed more beholden to Rome and foreign courtiers than to his own people. Across the realm, loyalties fractured. Some barons clung to the crown, convinced that rebellion threatened the very order of society. Others rallied to Simon, drawn by his charisma and his insistence that law must bind the king. Towns and shires, too, split in allegiance. Merchants resented the endless levies, while many clergy, torn between papal decrees and local grievances, found themselves hesitating. England became a house divided, its unity frayed by years of unresolved tension. Henry, though humiliated by past concessions, refused to yield further. Summoning all his strength, he gathered loyal nobles and summoned his son, Prince Edward, to his side. Edward, young, energetic, and fiercely ambitious, proved a sharp contrast to his father. Where Henry prayed for deliverance, Edward prepared for battle. He rode tirelessly across the countryside, raising men for the royal army, forging bonds with knights eager for honor. In him, many saw the promise of renewal for a monarchy weakened by Henry's indecision. Father and son together represented the determination of the crown to reassert its authority. The image of the kingdom that spring was cinematic. On one side, Simon de Montfort, banners of red and white snapping in the wind, leading ranks of armored knights sworn to uphold the provisions. On the other, Henry and Edward, their royal standards unfurled, gathering the loyalist host beneath the cross of St. George. Castles were fortified, villages trembled, and messengers raced across the land carrying calls to arms. For the first time since the anarchy, a century earlier, England faced the specter of war between its own. Simon proved an able commander. His discipline, honed in Gascony, gave the baronial forces cohesion, while his rhetoric gave them purpose. He framed the conflict not as rebellion, but as a holy duty to preserve law and custom. At his councils, he invoked Magna Carta, reminding his allies that they fought not for personal gain, but for the survival of the kingdom's liberties. His words inspired loyalty among men who might otherwise have wavered. Henry, meanwhile, leaned heavily on Edward. The king's piety was unshaken, but his resolve in the field was often uncertain. Edward, by contrast, exuded vigor. Chroniclers describe him leading charges, urging discipline, and vowing to crush the rebellion. His presence gave the royalist army confidence that the crown would not crumble without a fight. For Edward, the conflict was also personal. To him, Simon de Montfort was not merely a political rival, but a usurper of royal authority, a man who had insulted his father and threatened the very structure of kingship. As spring turned to summer, the two armies drew closer. Skirmishes flared in the countryside, strongholds changed hands, and both sides prepared for a decisive clash. The war was no longer a matter of charters and councils. It was a struggle for the soul of the realm. Could a king be bound by law, or must monarchy remain indivisible? Could governance by agreement endure, or would the sword settle the question? The answer would come on the fields of Sussex, at a place called Lewes. There, in May of 1264, the long building storm finally broke. On one side marched Henry and Edward, leading the might of royal authority. On the other stood Simon de Montfort, bearing the hopes of reform and the discontent of a kingdom. The Barons' War had begun in earnest, and the fate of England hung in the balance. The spring of 1264 reached its climax on the hills outside the market town of Lewes in Sussex. On the morning of May 14th, two armies faced one another across the undulating countryside, their banners whipping in the wind, their prayers echoing in chapels and campfires. The air was heavy with anticipation, the silence before a storm that everyone knew would decide the fate of England. Henry III and his son Prince Edward commanded the royal host. Their army was larger, bolstered by loyal barons, foreign mercenaries, and the prestige of the crown. Edward, restless and confident, urged an immediate assault, while Henry, older and less decisive, sought to steady the lines. On the other side stood Simon de Montfort, commanding a smaller but disciplined force of barons and knights. His men lacked the numbers of the royal host, but they carried with them a conviction that steadied their hands. They fought not only for lords and lands, but for the principle that even a king must bow to law. At dawn, de Montfort addressed his troops with words that chroniclers remembered for their fervor. He reminded them that their cause was righteous, their struggle not for rebellion, but for reform. He invoked the name of God and the promise of Magna Carta, assuring them that justice would favor their arms. His men, stirred by the speech, tightened ranks and marched to their positions on the slopes overlooking the king's army. The high ground gave them a tactical advantage, and Simon, experienced from campaigns in Gascony, knew how to use terrain as his ally. Edward struck first. Leading the cavalry on the royalist right, he charged with youthful vigor, scattering a wing of de Montfort's army. Chroniclers wrote of the brilliance of his charge, the flash of armor, the surge of horses sweeping across the field. For a moment, it seemed the crown's might would prevail, yet Edward, intoxicated by success, pressed his advantage too far. Pursuing the fleeing rebels across the countryside, he drove his knights out of the main battle, leaving the king's center dangerously exposed. De Montfort seized the moment. With calm precision, he regrouped his forces and struck at Henry's weakened lines. His command was measured, his movements deliberate. He urged his men forward, not with reckless fury, but with steady confidence. The baronial infantry pressed in, their banners rising against the royal standard. Henry, left vulnerable without his son's cavalry, found his army buckling under the assault. The battle raged through the day. Dust rising in choking clouds, cries of command mingling with the clash of steel. De Montfort's discipline told. His men held their ground, encircled Henry's troops, and slowly ground down the royal resistance. By evening, the outcome was clear. The king's forces were in disarray, his loyal barons retreating, his standard overrun. Henry himself was captured, along with his brother Richard of Cornwall, who was forced to surrender after taking refuge in a nearby windmill. When Edward returned with his exhausted cavalry, the battle was already lost. Surrounded and outnumbered, he too was taken prisoner. The capture of both king and prince was a shock unlike any England had known. The crown, long revered as untouchable, now lay in the hands of the very man who had once knelt as the king's brother-in-law. Chroniclers recorded the astonishment of the realm. The anointed monarch of England, no longer master of his kingdom, but a prisoner of his own barons. The image was unforgettable. Henry, solemn and weary, escorted under guard. Edward, young and furious, stripped of command. Simon de Montfort, calm and resolute, standing as victor. The symbolism reverberated across Europe. In one stroke, the balance of power in England had shifted. The king was captive, the reformers triumphant, and a new experiment in governance was about to begin. Louis was more than a battle. It was the moment when ideals long debated in parchment and council halls were written into history with action. It proved that the monarchy, though sanctified, could be checked, that nobles, if united, could humble the crown. For Henry, it was humiliation. For Simon, it was vindication. For England, it was a turning point that would redefine the nature of kingship itself. After Louis, Simon de Montfort stood at the height of his power. The king was his prisoner, the prince disarmed, and the barons looked to him as the architect of a new order. Yet Simon's vision extended beyond victory on the battlefield. He did not seize the crown for himself, nor did he seek to reduce England to the rule of a few great lords. His ambition, sharpened by years of conflict, was to create a structure of government that could endure, one that bound monarchy, nobility, and, for the first time, the commons together in a single council. In January 1265, Simon summoned a parliament unlike any England had ever seen. Councils of barons and bishops had long existed, but now he called not only the magnates, but also 2 knights from each shire, and, most revolutionary of all, representatives from the boroughs, men chosen from towns to speak on behalf of merchants and citizens. It was a bold step, born of necessity as much as conviction. Simon knew he needed broad support to secure his position, but he also believed that governance must rest on consent more widely than the circle of noblemen around the throne. The image chroniclers preserve is cinematic. In the great hall, torches flared against the stone walls, casting long shadows over a gathering that seemed to stretch the very definition of politics. There sat barons in their finery, bishops with crow's ears gleaming, knights in plain cloaks, and townsmen in merchants' robes. The hall was noisy, filled with the murmur of many voices, some accustomed to power, others new to it. For the first time in England's history, the governance of the realm was not confined to the nobility, but included men whose wealth and labor, not their lineage, gave them standing. Simon presided with gravity, aware of the precedent he was setting. He spoke of justice, of the duty of rulers to seek the counsel of the whole community, not merely the powerful few. To him, this parliament was more than a political maneuver. It was the embodiment of his belief in government by agreement. Each knight and burgess, though humble in status compared to dukes and earls, carried the authority of those who had chosen them. Their presence declared that the burdens of the realm must be shared, and so too must its decisions. For the merchants and townsmen, the summons was astonishing. Never before had they been invited to sit beside barons in the councils of the kingdom. Their grievances about tolls, taxes, and trade could now be voiced within the very chamber Where laws were shaped, the chroniclers note their awe, their sense of stepping into a world once reserved for the few. To them, it was as if the walls of government had opened and allowed new voices to echo within. This Parliament of 1265 did not create a permanent institution. It was a fragile experiment, dependent on Simon's authority and the circumstances of civil war. Yet its significance was immense. Later generations would look back and see in it the seed of the House of Commons, the foundation of a system in which the voice of the people, through knights and burgesses, would stand beside that of nobles and bishops. Simon, whether he foresaw the full extent or not, had planted a principle that would reshape English history. The king, though still a captive, was present in form if not in power. Henry's authority had been hollowed out, reduced to a figurehead, while Simon guided the machinery of state. The symbolism was clear. Monarchy remained, but it was bound, reshaped, and forced into consultation with a broader assembly. This was not the destruction of kingship, but its transformation. To Henry's supporters, the spectacle was shocking, even scandalous. To elevate merchants and lesser knights alongside barons was, in their eyes, an affront to tradition. They whispered that Simon had gone too far, that he was overturning the order of society. Yet for many in England, merchants weary of arbitrary tolls, peasants hoping for fair governance, and lesser lords anxious for accountability, Simon's experiment offered hope. The moment glows in memory. The crowded hall, the mingling of robes and armor, the flicker of torchlight on parchment as new voices signed their names. It was, for a brief instant, a vision of a kingdom where authority was shared more widely, where law restrained power, and where even those beyond the circle of nobility had a place at the table. Simon de Montfort's parliament would not survive long. The tides of war would turn, and his triumph would prove temporary. Yet in that winter of 1265, he gave England a glimpse of a future that neither Henry nor Edward could ever erase. It was the beginning of an idea that governance must be more than the command of kings, that the community of the realm must have a voice that would echo through centuries to come. The triumph at Lewes and the Parliament of 1265 seemed, for a brief moment, to mark the dawn of a new era. Simon de Montfort appeared not merely as a baron victorious in war, but as a statesman who had reshaped the very fabric of governance. Yet the currents of power in England were never still. In the summer of that same year, the tide turned with dramatic swiftness, driven not by Henry, still a diminished figure under custody, but by his son, Prince Edward. Edward had been confined after Lewes, held as a hostage to ensure the compliance of the crown. But the young prince was resourceful. Through guile, charm, and a carefully orchestrated deception, he gained the trust of his captors. Allowed a measure of freedom to ride and hunt, he seized his chance. Chroniclers describe how Edward mounted his horse under the pretense of exercise, only to gallop away at full speed, leaving his guards behind. With that bold escape, the fortunes of the crown were revived. Once free, Edward wasted no time. He moved across the countryside with remarkable energy, rallying loyal barons, recalling old alliances, and summoning fresh levies. His charisma, already formidable, now burned with the fire of destiny. Knights who had hesitated before flocked to his banner. Veterans of Lewes, eager to redeem the humiliation, joined his cause. Castles once surrendered to de Montfort opened their gates to the heir of the throne. Within weeks, Edward transformed from prisoner to commander of a rejuvenated royalist army. Simon, meanwhile, struggled to hold together his fragile coalition. His authority, so firm after Lewes, began to erode. Some nobles, wary of his radical inclusion of townsmen in Parliament, slipped back toward the king's side. Others, wearied by months of conflict, sought reconciliation. Simon still commanded loyalty from his core supporters, but his position was precarious. His forces were spread thin, and Edward's resurgence caught him off balance. The confrontation came at Evesham on August 4th, 1265. Simon, attempting to unite with his son who was bringing reinforcements, marched his men into the vale near the town. Heavy rain swept the countryside, the sky dark with storm. As his army advanced, he realized too late that Edward had intercepted his son and now commanded the surrounding heights. From the hills above Evesham, royalist banners unfurled, rows upon rows of knights, their lances gleaming like lightning beneath the storm clouds. Simon's men, trapped in the valley below, faced overwhelming odds. Chroniclers describe Simon looking upon the royalist array and recognizing the fate that awaited him. "The Lord have mercy on our souls," he is said to have murmured, "for our bodies are theirs." Yet he did not waver. Donning his armor, he prepared his followers for a last stand, urging them to fight with honor. Edward led the charge himself, the image of youth and vengeance incarnate. Rain lashed against the steel of his host as they thundered down the slopes. The clash in the valley was fierce and unrelenting. Simon's smaller force fought with courage, but they were encircled, pressed from all sides by the weight of Edward's knights. The storm mirrored the chaos of the field. Thunder cracked above, rain turned the ground to mire, and banners whipped violently in the gale. In the swirl of battle, Simon de Montfort fell, struck down amidst his companions. His body was left on the field, a stark symbol of the rebellion's collapse. Henry himself, present under duress in Simon's ranks, was spared in the tumult. Rescued by Edward's men, the king was restored to his family and his throne. Chroniclers lingered on the contrast. The father, humiliated and captive only months before, now freed. The son, triumphant and resplendent, hailed as the savior of monarchy. The image of Evesham was unforgettable. Edward riding tall upon his horse, leading the royalist host through storm and victory. Simon, once master of the kingdom, lying fallen in the mud of the valley. The battle was remembered not simply as a clash of arms, but as the decisive end to an experiment in governance. The hope that England might be ruled through a broader parliament collapsed with Simon's death. Evesham was called by chroniclers the murder of England for the devastation it wrought upon the cause of reform. Yet, even in defeat, Simon's legacy endured. His Parliament of 1265, brief though it was, had shown that governance could include more than king and baron. His fall gave victory to monarchy, but his vision sowed seeds that would outlast the triumph of Edward. For the moment, however, it was Edward's day. The storm cleared, and the crown was restored. Father and son stood together again. Henry, weary but free. Edward, fierce and ascendant, the future Edward the Vert already revealed in youth. England was united once more under the crown, but the memory of Simon de Montfort's dream lingered, a shadow that would inspire future generations whenever kings forgot that power, however divine, must answer to law. When the storm of Evesham cleared, Henry III once again stood as King of England. The crown, so recently humbled at Lewes and bound in Simon de Montfort's custody, was restored to its rightful place. Yet the Henry who resumed power in 1265 was not the same monarch who had once ruled without check. Victory had freed him from captivity, but it had not erased the memory of humiliation. The shadow of Lewes lingered, and with it, the realization that even an anointed king could be compelled by his subjects to share authority. Henry's first acts after his restoration were marked by a mixture of triumph and caution. He moved quickly to re-establish royal government, reappointing loyal officials and rewarding those who had stood by the crown in its darkest hour. Edward, the true architect of victory, was celebrated as a hero, his reputation cemented as the rising force of the monarchy. Yet even as Henry sought to resume the old patterns of rule, he could not wholly ignore the lessons of rebellion. The barons, exhausted by years of conflict, were not eager to plunge the kingdom into further war. Many of them, though opposed to Simon's radicalism, had sympathized with the grievances that had driven reform. They accepted Henry's return, but only under tacit understanding that certain principles had been made permanent. Magna Carta, once a contested document signed under duress, now stood unshaken as the bedrock of political life. No king could simply dismiss it as a relic. Its promise that royal authority must be exercised within the bounds of law remained a living force, stronger than it had been before the wars. This uneasy reconciliation gave Henry space to reign, but with limits. The nobles no longer trusted unchecked monarchy, and while they submitted to the crown, they expected consultation, restraint, and some measure of accountability. The experiment of Simon's Parliament had been crushed on the battlefield, yet its spirit lingered. Townsmen and lesser knights were not summoned again in such bold fashion during Henry's lifetime, but the precedent could not be forgotten. The idea that government might include voices beyond the baronage had been planted, and though dormant, it would grow in centuries to come. In the years following Evesham, Henry governed more quietly. He leaned heavily on Edward, who increasingly took the lead in both military and political affairs. The king, older now and chastened by years of strife, seemed content to let his son bear the burdens of power. Henry's reign after 1265 was no longer marked by sweeping ambitions in Sicily or grand projects that strained the realm. Instead, it was characterized by consolidation, reconciliation, and a careful avoidance of renewed confrontation. The people of England, weary of war, also sought stability. Villages that had seen armies tramp across their fields welcomed the return of peace. Merchants, long pressed by extraordinary taxes, were relieved when trade began to revive. Clergy, caught between papal authority and baronial reform, found solace in a calmer settlement. To many, Henry's restored rule was imperfect, but it was preferable to the chaos of civil war. Still, beneath the surface, the memory of de Montfort remained. To some, he was a traitor who had overstepped the bounds of loyalty. To others, he was a martyr for the cause of liberty. His vision of Parliament, though defeated, survived in chronicles and in the imaginations of reformers yet unborn. Henry had regained his throne, but he had not erased Simon's legacy. The restoration of the monarchy after Evesham was thus not a return to the unchecked authority of old, but the beginning of a tempered kingship. Henry ruled, but with the knowledge that his power had limits. The barons obeyed, but with the conviction that they had rights. Magna Carta, tested in rebellion and reaffirmed in compromise, had entered the very marrow of English governance. The image of Henry in his later years reflects this transformation. Once accused of extravagance and indecision, he now appeared as a chastened ruler, cloaked more in humility than glory. He still prayed fervently, still adorned Westminster with beauty, but he reigned with less ambition, more caution. The throne was his, but the kingdom was no longer wholly his to command. In this delicate balance lay the true consequence of the Barons' War. Henry had been restored, yes, but England itself had changed. The idea that law could bind a king had survived the battlefield and taken root in the soul of the nation. In the years following the Barons' War, the figure of Prince Edward began to loom ever larger over the kingdom. Though his father Henry III remained on the throne until 1272, it was Edward's hand that increasingly shaped the destiny of England. The prince had passed through the crucible of rebellion and emerged tempered by both triumph and defeat. He had felt the sting of captivity after Lewis, tasted the glory of Evesham, and witnessed firsthand the peril of a monarchy estranged from its realm. From these experiences, he drew lessons that would define his future reign. Edward understood, as perhaps no Plantagenet before him, that raw military power could not secure a crown alone. He had seen how Henry's reliance on foreign favorites and disregard for noble grievances had weakened royal authority, pushing the barons into open revolt. He had also seen how Simon de Montfort's daring reforms could rally townsmen and knights to a vision of shared governance. Edward did not adopt Simon's program, but he grasped the reality it revealed, that kingship could not stand apart from the community it governed. To endure, it must combine strength with shrewdness, command with consultation. In his youth, Edward had been fiery, even reckless. His pursuit of fleeing troops at Lewis had cost the crown victory that day. But after Evesham, his impetuousness gave way to a more measured resolve. He began to master the balance between boldness and patience, learning when to strike swiftly and when to build alliances. He cultivated loyalty among knights and magnates alike, binding them to him not only through oaths, but through a sense of shared purpose. The image of Edward that emerged in these years was of a leader as capable in council as on horseback. He also came to appreciate the symbolic power of law. Magna Carta, once dismissed by some as a nuisance, had become a permanent fixture in English politics. Edward recognized that it could not be ignored or undone. Instead, he resolved that it should be embraced, not as a shackle, but as a shield, a framework within which monarchy could endure without provoking rebellion. In later years, he would confirm Magna Carta multiple times, ensuring that its principles were woven into the very fabric of his rule. This was not weakness, but strategy. By respecting the charter, Edward secured the loyalty of his subjects while preserving the strength of the crown. At the same time, Edward prepared himself for a reign defined by expansion and order. He studied the weaknesses that had plagued his father's government: indecision, extravagance, dependence on Rome, and resolved not to repeat them. Where Henry had been hesitant, Edward would be decisive. Where Henry had leaned on foreign courtiers, Edward would root his power in the loyalty of English knights and the discipline of his armies. Where Henry had been content to drift, Edward envisioned a monarchy active and assertive, capable of shaping not only England but also Wales, Scotland, and beyond. Chroniclers of the age, watching the young prince in these years, sensed the transformation. They described him as tall and commanding, his presence magnetic, his will unyielding. In tournaments, he proved his skill as a warrior. In councils, he demonstrated a growing mastery of politics. To many, it seemed that Edward embodied the vigor that Henry had lacked. While the old king retreated into piety and ritual, the prince looked outward, already preparing for the responsibilities that awaited him. The court itself began to adjust. Nobles increasingly turned to Edward for leadership, recognizing that his star was rising. Even those who had once opposed the crown found in him a figure they could follow, for he combined the authority of lineage with the energy of reform. The towns, too, sensed that under Edward, their interests might find greater recognition, so long as they aligned with his vision of a strong, orderly kingdom. In these transitional years, England itself seemed to hold its breath. The rebellion had been quelled, but its memory lingered. Henry's authority was restored, but everyone knew it was Edward who embodied the future. The lessons of the Barons' War, the need for consultation, the limits of royal power, the strength of law, were etched into his mind, and when he would ascend the throne as Edward I, he carried with him not only the blood of kings, but the wisdom of experience hard-won. The image of Edward in this period is vivid. A young man hardened by conflict, riding across the countryside to inspect castles, summoning councils where he listened as well as commanded, dreaming of a realm united under strong but lawful monarchy. He had seen the fragility of crowns when they stood alone, and he resolved that his would rest on firmer ground. In his rise, one glimpses the foundation of a reign that would be remembered as one of the most formidable in medieval England, a reign born not only of victory, but of the hard lessons learned in the shadow of civil war. The Barons' War, though bloody and disruptive, left behind a legacy far greater than the struggles of its participants. It was not merely a clash of armies or the rivalry of Henry III and Simon de Montfort. It was, in truth, the beginning of a transformation in English political life. From its battles and its councils emerged principles that would echo across centuries, shaping the very idea of governance in England and eventually far beyond its shores. At the heart of this legacy was the recognition that the power of the king could no longer stand unchecked. Before Lewis and Evesham, monarchy was often seen as divine, indivisible, and absolute in practice. Afterward, even though Henry was restored and Edward prepared to rule with vigor, no one could forget that a group of nobles had once seized the king himself, compelled him to accept reform, and momentarily remade the kingdom. The notion that royal authority must be exercised with the consent of the realm, once an aspiration written in Magna Carta, had been proven in action. Simon de Montfort's Parliament of 1265, though short-lived, embodied this shift. By summoning not only nobles and bishops, but also knights and burgesses, Simon expanded the circle of political voice. His experiment did not survive the battlefield, but it set a precedent impossible to erase. The idea that towns and counties should send representatives to speak for their interests had been born. In time, this principle would solidify into the English Parliament, an institution that became the cornerstone of constitutional government. Later generations would look back at de Montfort's Parliament as the seed from which the House of Commons grew. The message of the Barons' War was clear. Kingship could not be absolute. Power to endure required consent. Even as Edward I rose to build a stronger monarchy, he did so with this lesson etched into his reign. He confirmed Magna Carta. Repeatedly, not merely to placate the nobility, but because he understood that legitimacy required more than force. The people of England, whether noble, knight, or merchant, expected their voices to matter, and even the most powerful monarch could not forever ignore them. Chroniclers of the age often describe the war as tragic, a fratricidal conflict that divided the realm. And indeed, villages burned, alliances fractured, and families were torn apart. But beneath the suffering lay a deeper significance. The war demonstrated that reform was not just a dream of parchment charters, but a living demand that could reshape the kingdom. It proved that governance could be challenged, that authority could be restrained, and that even failure could leave behind a vision powerful enough to outlast defeat. In the long sweep of history, the Barons' War became a milestone. It bridged the gap between Magna Carta and the evolution of Parliament. It taught rulers that the crown must rest on more than divine right. It must rest on the partnership of king and realm. And it offered to future generations the enduring truth that liberty, once claimed, cannot easily be silenced. The image of this legacy is cinematic in its own way. The smoky halls of Oxford where provisions were signed, the crowded chamber of 1265 where merchants rubbed shoulders with barons, the storm-swept field of Evesham where dreams of reform were dashed but not extinguished. Each scene, whether of triumph or tragedy, contributed to the same story, the slow, often painful birth of constitutional government in England. By the time Edward I ascended the throne, the realm had changed. He would wage wars in Wales and Scotland, raise castles and laws that bore his name, and strengthen the crown with iron resolve. Yet even Edward, formidable as he was, ruled in a world reshaped by the memory of rebellion. The Barons' War had shown that the will of the community could check the will of the king. That truth, once revealed, would never again be forgotten. In his final years, Henry III seemed less a monarch of command than a relic of devotion. Age had bent his frame and dimmed his vigor, yet his piety and love for beauty endured. He spent long hours within Westminster Abbey, the church he had rebuilt into a monument of faith and splendor. Its soaring vaults, painted walls, and jeweled windows were his true legacy, a palace for God more enduring than any of his political victories. One can imagine him in those twilight days, seated quietly in the nave, robes heavy upon his frail shoulders, his gaze lifted to the stained glass. Sunlight streamed through in shards of color, reds, blues, and golds dancing across the stone floor. In those moments, Henry appeared at peace, surrounded not by barons or courtiers, but by the silence of prayer and the radiance of art. He had not been a strong king, nor a shrewd ruler of men, but in the abbey, he had built something transcendent. Yet even in the stillness, shadows lingered. Henry's reign had been scarred by rebellion, his authority tested as no English monarch's had been before. The provisions of Oxford, the Barons' War, the rise and fall of Simon de Montfort, all were chapters written in strife. The memory of captivity at Lewes and the shock of civil war had left marks that no triumph at Evesham could erase. To his critics, he remained the king who had squandered resources and weakened the crown. To others, he was the gentle ruler whose love for the sacred had given England one of its greatest treasures. His reign was both light and shadow, a paradox of devotion and division. It is in this cinematic image that his story finds its ending. The aged king, cloaked in silence, watching light spill through the abbey's windows. The beams of color seem almost to tell his tale, fragments of glory mixed with sorrow, hope woven with regret. The abbey, filled with beauty, was also filled with memory, every stone whispering of a reign that had tested the very soul of the realm. Into this chamber of light stepped Edward, tall, commanding, the vigor of youth unbroken. As he walked beneath the soaring arches, sunlight shifted, falling across his face. In the gleam of the stained glass, he appeared as both son and successor, the future embodied in a single stride. Henry, weary and near his end, looked upon him with resignation and perhaps with pride, knowing that the kingdom would pass into stronger hands. For Edward, the abbey was more than his father's creation. It was a symbol of the burdens he would inherit. The lessons of rebellion, the memory of Simon de Montfort, the unyielding presence of Magna Carta, all awaited him as he prepared to write his own chapter. The light that fell upon him in that moment was not merely the sun's. It was the illumination of destiny, casting the promise of a new reign over the old king's shadow. Thus, the story closes in a union of contrasts. Henry, the king of piety and art, who left Westminster as his offering to eternity, and Edward, the king-in-waiting, who would forge order and strength from the fractures of civil war. The abbey, filled with both silence and light, held them both, the past in its stones, the future in its glow. Henry's reign ended, as all reigns must, but the world he left was altered forever. He had not destroyed the monarchy, but he had transformed it. Through conflict and compromise, through error and endurance, he had shown that a king's power was not absolute, that law and community had their rightful place beside the crown. His failures opened the path for reform, his devotion left beauty that still endures, and his story, caught between shadow and light, became part of England's long journey toward constitutional kingship. And so the camera of history lingers on that final vision, the abbey's windows aflame with color, the old king fading into twilight, and the young prince standing in the glow, light falling across his face, heralding the dawn of a new chapter in England's tale.